Many people would be understandably mistaken in assuming that adapting Lord of the Rings was Peter Jackson's dream project. That label actually belongs to remaking King Kong, which he got to release in 2005 after the original had inspired him to become a filmmaker as a kid and remained his favourite film ever since. The passion for the project and the respect for the original are clear as day in the extensive behind-the-scenes footage, but whether or not they were able to make a good film is up for debate, and that respect, Jackson's deep love for the original, may have actually been a detriment to doing so. This 1933 production about a boat crew travelling to a mysterious island, saving a damsel from the giant gorilla that lives there, and bringing that gorilla back to wreak havoc on New York, hasn't aged particularly well in terms of narrative or technical proficiency, but is nonetheless an interesting and sort of charming time capsule of early monster and disaster movies. As such an old and influential film, King Kong has of course suffered numerous sequels, remakes, and crossovers with the other famous big monster, Godzilla. Continuing to this day in a blockbuster action genre that has become known as kaiju. Now, those movies serve their mindless purpose of showing indestructible monsters crashing into buildings, but much like the original Godzilla, the original King Kong, Peter Jackson's 2005 remake, and the 1976 remake starring Jeff Bridges all try to incorporate different flavours of seriousness to the same major plot beats. The original had the novelty of the idea in its favour, as well as the horror of watching what we can now see to be some very janky stop-motion animation of various giant creatures killing people. The 1976 remake is the worst and least serious of the three, but only occasionally manages to achieve so bad it's good status by playing up the weird tension between Kong and the woman he abducts. Not helped by Kong looking much more like a man in an elaborate Halloween costume than an actual gorilla. Peter Jackson's remake is overindulgent, extremely sentimental, and kind of meta in how it approaches changing the original. Naomi Watts as Anne Darrow, Jack Black as Carl Denham, and Adrian Brody as Jack Driscoll are the three main human characters we're introduced to in the 1930s New York and boat travel scenes that make up the quite lengthy Act 1 before reaching the island. Unlike the 1970 set 1976 remake, Jackson decided to match the era of the original.
Said I'd find a girl. For God's sake, Preston, think like a winner. Call Jack. I need that goddamn screenplay.
Jack Black is the casting choice that stood out back then and stands out even more now, kind of hitting the right facial expressions but lacking a nuance, subtlety and depth, whilst playing the sleazy, opportunistic filmmaker who recruits Anne Darrow off the street.
What type of person are you?
I'm someone you can trust, Anne. I'm a movie producer.
Anne is given more depth than the original character, still kind of ditzy and naive as the damsel everybody dies trying to rescue, but with a moral centre that comes into use with her and Kong's relationship, making that by far the biggest narrative improvement in this remake. After her previous place of theatrical employment shuts down and she tries to steal an apple because this is the Depression and everybody's poor and hungry, Denham convinces her to come play a lead role in the movie he's shooting on an obviously sketchy voyage. Jack Driscoll, as the screenwriter of the fake movie, is stalled from leaving the boat until it's too late, so he has no choice but to finish the screenplay on board, staying in a cage the boat crew usually use to transport animals, in an obvious commentary on real-life screenwriting or just being in the movie industry, and becoming Anne's romantic interest amongst what Peter Jackson spends a chunk of screen time attempting to make an ensemble cast, all of the uninteresting members of which end up still lacking the screen time to be noteworthy enough for the audience to care, remember their names, or remember any scenes that were wasted on them, such as this guy called Jimmy, who reads Heart of Darkness, overhears the insanely overdramatic reveal of the name Skull Island at a point where most of the crew thought they were heading for Singapore, and really wants to help rescue Anne after Kong takes her deep into the forest. His father figure and the ship's first mate, Ben Hayes, is like a World War I veteran or something, so he leads the rescue mission until he dies. Andy Serkis is there, hamming it up in his human role as the ship's cook, who has by far the most gruesome death in the whole film. Colin Hanks is Denham's personal assistant, and I literally couldn't tell you anything else about him if I tried. Likewise, I can't remember anything about the Asian guy or the camera guy. And finally, there's Captain Englehorn and Bruce Baxter, the fake movie's lead actor, whose role in that fake movie is pretty much a parody of the captain from the original film.
I guess you don't think much of women on ships, do you?
No, they're a nuisance.
I guess you don't think much of women on ships, do you?
No, they're a nuisance.
During the rescue mission, Baxter actually ends up filling the adventure hero's shoes of his celebrity persona when he helps save the crew who fell in the insect pit, or at least what little of the crew remains. Other than that, I think he's meant to be comedic relief, but Jack Black ends up accidentally being the comedic relief anyway, particularly this scene of being brought nearly to tears whilst shooting the fake movie that really doesn't seem like it has anything about it worth getting that invested in.
He doesn't love you. You know that he's the one that you love. Why doesn't he love? Good. That's it. Don't smile.
Early on during principal photography, things got a bit hectic when screenwriters Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens, who all worked together writing Lord of the Rings, decided to do some last-minute script revisions, specifically fixing what they saw to be a major issue with all of this stuff preceding the island, that there wasn't any sense of mystery or adventure, without which the entire voyage seemed tensionless. To be honest, I'm not sure the bit of mystery they added with the map and only Driscoll and the captain knowing where they were truly heading added that tension they were looking for, because even without seeing the original film, audiences in 2005 and today would still kind of know what to expect from this concept. It's just odd that after the extensive pre-production that was essential to the success of Lord of the Rings, the same team found themselves in this situation for a much simpler story. Or maybe the simplicity and lack of substance the original provides compared to the breadth of adaptational material Tolkien provides was precisely the problem. But then King Kong 2005 also looks far less impressive than Lord of the Rings, despite also sharing the same cinematographer, production designer, and numerous other crew members. Jackson was first approached about helming a King Kong remake in 1996, right after finishing The Frighteners, but the more conventional Indiana Jones-esque action-adventure script they were writing got put on hold because Universal didn't want to release a monkey movie at the same time as Mighty Joe Young, or a giant monster disaster movie at the same time as the American Godzilla, and so Jackson and his team shifted focus to Lord of the Rings instead. As I'm sure you know, that ended up taking quite a while, made a bunch of money, and won an unprecedented amount of awards. And when Jackson was gladly welcomed back to King Kong, having accumulated a bunch of experience, skills, and technology from Lord of the Rings, they completely reworked the 1996 script into something much closer to the original King Kong, except now with much more creative freedom to do whatever they wanted, spending what ended up being the highest reported budget in the history of cinema up to that point. That is, if you don't count Lord of the Rings as one production, because if you do, that was still way more. The further we move into Skull Island, the less surprising it is that Jackson had to serve up a big pile of his own money to cover where they were still managing to spill over that huge budget. The reveal of Skull Island through the mist combines ominous with wondrous until the crew sets foot on the land, walks into an uninviting tribal village set piece, and are abruptly surrounded by natives that attack them. Their portrayal as tribalistic worshippers of Kong who sacrifice their young women to be his brides, somehow much worse than their portrayal in the original film, where they at least communicated and told the crew to leave before deciding they wanted Anne to be their sacrifice instead. They are effectively menacing and creepy, but the only part of their portrayal that isn't offensively, stereotypically shallow is that they choose Anne as the replacement sacrifice because her scream gets a reaction out of Kong, and not just because she's an exotic Caucasian woman they believe would make a more worthy sacrifice based on that alone.
He's offering to trade 6 of his women for Anne.
Although the more interesting and humanizing motivation that could have been explored had anyone from the tribe actually become a character involved in the rest of this over 3-hour movie is that they'd rather sacrifice this random woman who just arrived on their island instead of one of their own, of which there must be very few based on this tiny retreat they inhabit behind the wall protecting them from the island's creatures. This blatant regression in which the entire tribe are caricatured as crazy and alien is odd given it is neither honouring or modernising the original. Anyway, after escaping the attack, the crew are rushing to get the boat free from the rocks when some of the natives sneak on board and drag Anne back to the island to be instantly sacrificed. Nobody on the boat notices until they're too late to stop her being taken away by Kong, and she spends the rest of the movie barefoot in this nightdress because apparently that's what she felt comfortable changing into whilst completely alone on the boat floating just outside the island people just got killed on. What follows for the big chunky middle of the film is scene after scene of almost plotless CGI monsters killing crew members, fighting each other, or working together to fight Kong, whilst Anne runs around or gets shaken around in one of Kong's giant gorilla hands, from which, and this is easily the most superhuman thing in the film, she suffers no broken bones, concussions, or really any injuries of any kind. The filmmaking illusion and mysteriousness of the island that was no doubt more enthralling to watch with those effects being so groundbreaking in the 30s isn't helped much at all by the lower quality action scenes, in particular the Brontosaurus stampede, in which the CGI dinos and human actors constantly look to be occupying entirely different planes of reality, running on treadmills and further breaking immersion just by surviving such a ridiculous ordeal, and then the swamp scene, because this underwater nonsense doesn't look any better than it did in Lord of the Rings, and since the entire thing was cut from the theatrical version, it was clearly deemed the least necessary, narratively only doubling down on demonstrating Denham's unconvincing filmmaking obsession. The extended version is only 12 minutes longer than the already 3-hour theatrical version, most of that taken up by this swamp scene, but if entire expensive CGI action sequences are getting removed from your blockbuster adventure movie, then things don't seem quite right. Usually, those are the scenes the boring story stuff would get removed to make room for. Was Jackson trying to be as extravagant and huge in scale as the original, or was he trying to recreate how difficult it now is to take that stop motion seriously? With these two scenes, he definitely succeeded at the latter. Adrian Brody's character might be overloaded with plot armor as Jimmy shoots the insects climbing over his body and face without actually biting him, but the realism of the insect pit scene obviously had more attention given to it, which makes sense given recreating it would have been a primary motivation of Jackson's. That scene in the original film cut out of test screenings after being deemed too scary and the footage being lost. If the insect pit is the best piece of horror, then Kong vs the T-Rexes is by far the best choreographed piece of action. However, it's the quiet, still moments that really stand out, where the CGI is used to substantially enhance the story, crucially lingering on details that have to fill in for Kong not having any dialogue. And Kong himself was, thankfully, a huge achievement in motion capture. He fluctuates a bit in how he interacts with Naomi Watts, but when left on his own to throw a gorilla tantrum, have a close-up on some nuanced facial expressions, or fight other monsters, it's all as good as CGI could get at the time. The team was still redesigning Kong when trailers featuring him had already been released, so the final 6 or so months of post-production crunch being dedicated to getting the titular character up to standard would definitely explain why some of the other CGI falls short in quality. There's no doubt that the biggest blessing of the 1996 project being put on hold and everyone moving over to Lord of the Rings is the discovery of Andy Serkis to make use of the new motion capture technology. Gollum was groundbreaking, iconic, and a more interesting character than Kong, but the gorilla proportions and mannerisms made this a far more difficult undertaking. Serkis, in his mad genius, secretly travelled to Rwanda without permission he wouldn't have been able to get anyway, in order to observe gorillas in the wild, wild, studying their movement and social behaviour firsthand after already doing so at the zoo. On set, although he himself wasn't being filmed with the other actors, he showed up in a DIY gorilla suit and fake teeth that made everyone wonder what the hell this guy was doing, only to soon realise the impact his presence and guttural roars had on setting the atmosphere, in particular giving Naomi Watts someone to react to and actually act with, instead of staring at green screens all day.
The amazing thing with visual effects films is how much of the power of the visual effect depends on the power of the actors who are reacting to it. How strong and powerful they are will ultimately dictate how powerful your creature turns out to be.
I knew that she was receiving what I was able to give her and was using that, and so it was very gratifying for me. And I knew that further down the line, when it came to shoot Kong's reverses on the motion capture stage, we would be locked into the moment.
And got?
Then, later in the motion capture studio that was basically made up of just Serkis and a few technicians in a warehouse, he had to deliver his actual performance in the motion capture suit and face dots, often accompanied by a Barbie doll in place of Anne. How much of Kong's performance truly belongs to Serkis, and how much to the animators refining his motion capture footage or the sound designers enhancing his vocals, is open to debate, and only those involved would know for sure on a case-by-case basis. When the captured movement wasn't precise enough, it was often so difficult to adjust the dense data that the team found it easier to animate entire sequences from scratch, using Serkis's work as a reference. Even so, the final result stands as a powerful example of a motion-captured CGI character, Gollum and Kong's expressive physicality laying the groundwork for the continuously advancing motion capture seen in Avatar, the Planet of the Apes reboot, and hundreds of other movies and video games. The emotional depth provided here helps the film avoid the uncomfortable sexual undertones of the '76 remake, and make Kong more sympathetic and tragic than the original. But the balance isn't entirely convincing between Anne's sympathy for her captor, realising his loneliness as a sort of Hunchback of Notre Dame figure instead of just being a passive damsel in distress, compared to her wanting to escape his possessive interest and leave the dangers of the island. Ironically, if not for more runtime, it needed a montage or some other signifier that more time has passed of Kong and Anne surviving together to be a believably endearing relationship that doesn't still partially get swept up in this weird, mostly one-sided obsession the giant gorilla has for his new pet, who reluctantly entertains him for protection. After surviving the insect pit, Driscoll continues the search for Anne alone whilst the rest of the crew goes back to the wall. And no, this 1930s screenwriter wasn't properly developed as an action hero, and we haven't seen him and Anne have the chemistry to support such devotion. He finds her and Kong pretty much immediately, but I guess a giant gorilla leaves a trackable mark. Kong wakes up and pulls them back up the cliff with the vine they wouldn't have been able to descend all the way with anyway, and so their escape route becomes the even more absurd option of gliding down with one of the giant bats that was sleeping in the cave leading up to this cliff, whilst the rest distract Kong, landing in the water, apparently preventing them being picked back up and pulled in half.
You think he'll try and follow us all the way?
You can bet your life on it.
What do you want to do?
Let him be. Stop treating him like a monster. Stop making him into something he's not. We should all get off this island as fast as we can, Jack. We don't belong here.
They manage to outrun Kong back to the wall, which Kong tries to break through instead of climbing over, leading him into Denham's trap, which stops working the second Kong finds the strength of love, and starts working again when a harpoon lands in his leg and a bottle of chloroform smashes open on his face. 2 hours and 30 minutes into the film, they inexplicably drag the unconscious Kong aboard the boat, leave the island, and keep him secure or asleep long enough to return to New York. Kong breaking free and and terrorizing the city, meant to be the centerpiece of the tragedy that should be horrific enough to make us conflicted, finds itself at odds with amusing absurdity. The possibly unintentional of Kong frantically grabbing random blonde women in his search for Anne, only to toss them aside once he realizes they're not her, as well as the 100% intentional slapstick of an army officer finishing a comically villainous speech about stopping the beast before the transport truck gets instantly wiped out.
We cut its ugly head off, and we rev it up at the head!
Driscoll gets behind a wheel and leads Kong away from the crowd for a blockbuster chase sequence until Anne appears in the exact right place at the exact right time to distract him with an ice skating date.
The ice pond idea came from Philippa and Fran working with Andy on the mocap stage.
I gotta be honest, I was a bit skeptical. I was like, oh, crikey, is that getting a little bit... I don't know. I mean, you know, everyone has their own opinions.
A lot of people thought Ice Pond was a bit of a joke and that it would never, ever make the final film.
I remember having to convince the animators that this was going to be a really great sequence.
It did seem like a slightly crazy idea, but it was a brilliant idea because people at that point of the film were just really ready for something to give some happiness to Kong.
And I'm really proud of the sequence. I think the sequence is so beautiful.
I feel like I should feel bad for her, once again trapped entertaining a giant gorilla, and this time so it doesn't run around injuring random blonde women, but the film doesn't want me to feel bad for her. And if the ice is sturdy enough to support Kong's weight, one might reasonably ask why Anne, in this thin dress, isn't shivering cold and then freezing to death as they make their way up the Empire State Building, an iconic moment of ascending the tallest tower as though it were the highest cliff that it would be forbidden for any remake to exclude.
It was beauty killed the beast.
It is a tough pill to swallow that such a passionate team, still riding the high of Lord of the Rings, being given so much money to remake the director's favourite ever film, would end up being not very good, littered with early versions of a lot of the pitfalls Jackson would later fall into whilst trying to turn The Hobbit into a trilogy of 3-hour fantasy epics.
So we're on day 16, day 20, day 27, day 36, day 40, day 51, day 66. Welcome to day 77. Day 85. So today it's day 100. Okay, welcome to day 125 or 6 or 7 or whatever it is of our shoot. Finally made it through the shoot and we're in post-production. 30 weeks to go. 28 weeks to go. 24 weeks away from the opening of the movie. Oh, hello. 16 weeks to go. 14 weeks to go, don't panic. 8 weeks to the release of the film. It's 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week to go.
That year, 2005, Jackson wasn't the only blockbuster filmmaker to remake one of their personal favourite classic movies. He was joined by Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds. Spielberg also honoured various parts of the original book and 1953 film, but unlike Jackson's collection of dinosaur theme park rides, Spielberg's War of the Worlds follows its own distinct vision, albeit one that didn't stick the landing in its third act. There's a purpose behind Spielberg's creative decisions in order to make a specific film for a specific time and audience, but Jackson kind of just seems like he was making the most expensive fan movie ever, and it turns out that almost nobody is as big of a fan of King Kong as him.
These are the dinosaurs that inspired me when I was 8, 9 years old and I saw King Kong for the first time. So after 72 years, it's just amazing to think that they're sitting here right in front of us. An amazing piece of film history.